Welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Comprehensive History Instruction webinar series. Today, we are fortunate to have an exceptional presenter to discuss the disability rights movement. This session offers educators greater depth of knowledge about this civil rights movement that works to advocate for and secure equal rights for people with disabilities by breaking down institutional, physical, and social barriers. It also explores the impact that the movement has had on Michigan and our country. This is the seventh topic in a series that the department is offering associated with a comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history. As educators, we have the responsibility to teach the full breadth of history, including about searing and challenging subjects such as race, racism, sexism, and xenophobia. As searing as some of our history is, we have a responsibility to teach it all to our children. This broad effort will help you as educators learn more about historical movements, events, and peoples that are part of the complex, diverse history of our country and world, and by extension, help you explore the same comprehensive history with your students. We are grateful for our presenter today, Dr. Seena Skelton, Director of the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center and Director of Operations for the Great Lakes Equity Center. With more than 27 years of experience working in the areas of inclusive practices, systems change, and school improvement, Dr. Skelton has co-authored publications on topics related to improving outcomes for marginalized youth, including a book chapter on addressing equity and transition education for young people of color with disabilities. This webinar series will model discussion addressing equity and share opportunities on how educator practices support diverse school populations. Thanks to Dr. Skelton for sharing her expertise and assisting in the growth of knowledge and understanding among our Michigan educators. Thanks to the education organizations whose partnership in an era of attempts to narrow curriculum and encourage subject and book banning is inspiring in and of itself. Thanks to the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series team for its continued efforts in organizing these spaces for us to meet and learn. Finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for your courage, interest, and conviction. And now I'd like to turn it over to our social studies consultant in the Michigan Department of Education, Mr. Scott Koenig.
Thank you, Dr. Rice, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Scott Koenig, and I am a social studies consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I turn over the presentation to today's presenter, I have some housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature. Questions will be addressed toward the end of this event as time permits. If time does not permit, questions will be addressed through email. We will provide links and resources using the chat feature throughout today's presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Teaching Comprehensive History website. If you would like sketches for attending today, please be sure to sign in the sketch link that will be provided on several occasions in the chat during this presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the View button at the top right of the Zoom window. At the conclusion of the webinar today, a survey will be emailed to participants. Please share your feedback as it helps to inform future webinars. Closed captioning and an American Sign Language interpreter have been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Candace Barrier. Now, without further delay, please welcome Dr. Seena Skelton.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Dr. Rice, and thank you, the Teaching Comprehensive History team. I'm very excited to be with you all this afternoon. To have this really important conversation is really near and dear to my heart. So I'm just going to get us going and share my screen. And hopefully you can see my screen. And if you can, we can just let someone know, and we can make sure we get that remedied. So I want to start off by really talking about how I typically start when I'm having these kinds of important conversations is really just deconstructing the title. Because it's really important when we think about how we use language, we think about how we express ourselves, that there's meaning and intentionality in every way in which we express really important content. So I want to start off by talking about the title, Journey from Disability Rights to Disability Justice. And so this whole notion of what it means to be an individual with disability in this country and the rights that individuals with disabilities now are able to experience came at a long and hard fight. And now we're at a place where not only are we focused on rights for people with disabilities, but also beyond that to thinking about and talking about justice for everyone, including people with disabilities. Again, I'm Seena Skelton. I'm the Director of Operations for the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center. We're situated in Indiana University School of Education at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. I've been engaged in equity work or work around inclusive practices. I want to say all of my life. I was born as a person with a disability. And I am a native Michigander. So to be able to have this discussion with you all, even though I'm here in Indianapolis, to be able to talk with educators around the state is a real full circle moment for me. I started off my educational experience as a kindergarten in Detroit public school system. And the picture that you see to the left there is a picture of me at age 5. Getting ready to go to Greenfield Village, Henry Ford Village, that's located in Dearborn, Michigan. So you can see right away this little Black girl with a big smile on her face, ready to face life, ready to experience all the ways in which young people experience their reality, right? With no barriers, no perceived barriers in my mind. Yes, I looked a little different. My body was shaped a little different. I navigated my surroundings a little different, but for me, difference did not mean disability at that point. So when did disability really become an identity for me? It became an identity for me when I started school. And so that picture at the bottom part of the screen, that building, that very adorable building is Oakman Elementary School. This is a school that I attended as a kindergarten all the way up to 5th grade. And it was a school that was segregated specifically for students with orthopedic disabilities in Michigan. So I was educated in a segregated educational experience from the time I was 5 years old to the time I was 10. So for 5 years, I was in this sort of segregated environment. And I want to talk about what that means and how, while I was in a school building that was apart from my non-disabled peers, how even the right to be educated and receive a free and appropriate education came at a long journey, a long, hard fight. And then the picture that's at the top right corner is me today facilitating a professional learning experience. I started my career as a school psychologist, and so I have the unique experience of being really on both sides of the table. So being an educator in the public education system as a child with disability, and then becoming a practitioner in special education as a school psychologist. It's a little bit about me. So I want to talk about, before we get into the history of the disability rights movement, talk about this term disability and how we come to understand what disability is. And I want to put forth a position that disability in and of itself is a social construct, meaning that it is defined by the way in which we perceive physical and psychological impairments. And disability is not something that is a biological imperative or physical imperative, but it's really a perception, right? This is not to say that people don't have various different impairments, whether they be physical or whether they be psychological, but it's how we perceive impairments. It's how we construct the meaning of those impairments, and it's how we create our societal policies and practices and structures and attitudes that define whether an impairment is actually a disabling or disability or disabling condition. So I'll give you a couple of examples about that. So many of us wear glasses, and because we have visual impairments. The degree in which a visual impairment is considered a disability has a lot to do with how the environment and how society perceives various different visual differences of visual impairments. There was a community and a part of Martha's Vineyard. This is sort of back in the early 1920s, 1930s, where 1 in 25 individuals in that community was deaf. And almost 100% of the members of that community communicated, were basically multilingual or bilingual. And what I mean by that, they communicated and spoke in English, but they were also fluent in American Sign Language. In that particular society, individuals that were deaf were not thought of or considered to be disabled or to have a disability, because the society in that community was set up that their way of expressing and using language, there were no barriers constructed in the way that would have a perception that they were disabled. Hearing people use American Sign Language, and deaf people use American Sign Language. And in that society, being deaf was not a disability. Being deaf did not become a disability for those individuals, those deaf individuals, until they left that community and engaged in areas where the majority of the citizens were not fluent in ASL, and thereby structures and attitudes and practices created disabling conditions for individuals who were deaf. So it's an example of how disability can be a construction, a social construction, depending on how we think about the attitudes that we have, the practices that we engage in, the structures that we put in place, and the policies that are enacted. So with that understanding that disability is a social construction, let's move forward and talk about why is learning about disability rights and disability justice movement important. History, this is a quote by James Baldwin, and he talks about this idea of history. The history is not even the past, it's the present, because everyone operates, whether or not they know it, out of an assumption, which are assumptions which are produced only by our history. And so it's imperative that we understand our history. It's imperative that we understand a comprehensive understanding and view of our history, because so much of how we operate today come out of those assumptions that were created in our past. If we don't understand our past, we are more likely to repeat the mistakes of the past, as opposed to creating a new and envisioning a new future that is inclusive of all people. Disability history is US history, right? Disability history is US history. What you see here on the screen are various different historical figures that you may have learned about when you were a student, or that you may teach about now to students that are in your classrooms. And what you may or may not know, and what you may or may not teach, is that each and every one of these individuals are individuals with disabilities, right? So the first picture that you see is a picture of Alexander Graham Bell, the first older gentleman with the beard on the left-hand side. Alexander Graham Bell, we know his contribution to history, and we teach that, but do we also understand that he had a learning disability? Harriet Tubman is to the right of Alexander Graham Bell. We know her critical role in the advancement of civil rights before there was even a civil rights movement. Her advancement of helping enslaved individuals escape to freedom. And we teach that in our history class. But do we also teach that Harriet Tubman was a woman with a disability? Harriet Tubman had epilepsy. We know about Franklin D. Roosevelt, and we teach about him in our history class. But do we teach and do we know that he had polio and he was a wheelchair user? The bottom picture there on the left is a picture of a young Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, we know his contributions, right? We teach about his contributions, his inventions. But do we also know that Thomas Edison was almost deaf and had a significant hearing impairment? To the right there, when we teach about the civil rights movement, we may teach about Fannie Lou Hamer, who was one of the advocate in the civil rights movement, civil rights leader. But do we also know that she had polio and later became a wheelchair user? To the right there, we may teach about Barbara Jordan and her role in the Democratic National Convention and as a strong Democratic leader in our country. We may teach about her role as an African-American leader. But do we also know that Barbara Jordan had multiple sclerosis and that she later became a wheelchair user? And lastly, to the right, right corner, that is the author and activist and writer, Audre Lorde. In our literature class, we may teach about the writings of Audre Lorde. We may teach about her work as being a feminist and her work in advancing the feminist movement. But do we also know that Audre Lorde had low vision? Disability history is US history. But when we don't teach about the disabilities of major historical figures, we erase a part of who they are, we erase a part of their identities, and we erase the role models that these individuals have, not only for the historical contributions they've made to our country, but as people with disabilities. What it would be like for young people today who have disabilities to understand the contributions of others in the disability community to our country. What would it be like if our non-disabled children and students understand the contributions that historical figures who also had disabilities made in our country as well? Disability community is the largest minoritized community in our country with over 6 million adults and 3 million children. It is the largest and it is the most diverse. And because at any time, a person can become disabled. So when we think about people with disabilities, we want to not only think about them as individuals with different impairments that may or may not have an impact on how they navigate their lived experience. But we also want to think about people with disabilities as a political community, as a group of people with shared history, with shared lived experiences, with shared political interest, with shared aspects to experiencing the same rights and the same justice as non-disabled individuals. A little bit more information about just the diversity within the disability community. In terms of racial and ethnic diversity, only 1 in 5 adults with disabilities are white. More than 1/3 of individuals who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer have a disability. Over 25% of people with disabilities live in under-resourced communities. That's compared to 11% of non-disabled people. And approximately 12% of people who identify as people with disabilities are women. So this is the diversity that we see and we experience and we have within the disability community. But take just a moment, about 1 minute or so, I'm gonna actually set my timer and reflect on the information I've shared thus far. What does this information mean to you personally and how you think about disability? And to what extent has this information challenged the way you perceive disability, thought about disability, and taught about disability in your classrooms? So give about 1 minute to reflect. Okay. So how were people with disabilities treated early in our history? With stigmatization, isolation, and exclusion. Before the 1920s, people with disabilities battled or have battled, they continue to battle, centuries of biased assumptions and harmful stereotypes and irrational fears. And we still are encountering those same types of biases today. The stigmatization of disability resulted in social economic marginalization for generations of people with disabilities, similar to other marginalized groups. This left people with disabilities living in a state of impoverishment, a state of unemployment, and marginalized in many of our communities. In many instances, the only avenue of employment that people with disabilities were able to really experience were with being in these kinds of sort of what were called freak shows at the time, or side show circuses. Prior to the 1900s, people with disabilities were considered to be either tragic or pitiful, or someone to ridicule, or to use as entertainment. And while people with disabilities were marginalized in these shows and ostracized in these shows, unfortunately, for many people with disabilities, this is the only way that they can really earn a living to care for themselves. Families often experience pressure. Families of children with disabilities often experience pressure to hide their children, to keep their children at home or isolated or hidden, or to send them away to institutions and institutionalize them. This is again was due to stereotypes in society. Often parents of children with disabilities believe that the only way that their child could be cared for, they could receive any type of education, was to institutionalize them. But unfortunately, very little instruction or education was provided in these settings, and instead, many young people with disabilities were just warehoused in these facilities. In the early 1930s, 1920s, the eugenics movement really had a strong hold in our country and really worldwide. And the eugenics, proponents of the eugenic movement, believe that they can create the perfect human being by eliminating what they thought were the social ills, or people who were unfit to continue, unfit to give birth and to have children. What people in the eugenics movement believe is that through genetics and heredity, that bad behavior, criminal behavior, disabilities would be propagated throughout the generations. So they use various different methods to curtail what they believe the birth and continued production of individuals who were what they considered undesirable. One of the strategies that they used was sterilization. And so many people with disabilities were forced to undergo sterilization as a result of the eugenics movement. And the idea of this was that people with disabilities were segregated and then sterilized for the quote unquote betterment of society. In 1927, there was a pivotal court case that challenged the notion of eugenics, but unfortunately, it reinforced and pumped new energy in the eugenics movement. Carrie Buck, who was a young woman who had an intellectual disability, who became pregnant. And the facility that she was in wanted to move towards sterilizing her after she gave birth. So Buck versus Bell was a case that occurred in Virginia. And to make a decision on whether or not Carrie Buck could in fact undergo sterilization against her will. Justice Holmes at the time made a ruling and stated that the it was to the benefit of society that Carrie Buck would be sterilized. And he made this particular statement. I'm going to read it to you. This is from Justice Holmes. This is back in the 1927 Buck versus Bell. And he states, he wrote in his decision, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if we could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned. In order to prevent our being swamped by incompetence, it is better for all of the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." And this was a statement from Justice Holmes. So when did things begin to shift for people with disabilities? From being seen as undesirable, from being seen as not worthy to society, to being seen as being a drain to society, so much so that people with disabilities were forced to be sterilized or institutionalized or segregated. When did we begin to see the shift? We began to see the shift around the 1920s, particularly when soldiers returned home from World War I disabled. Then we began to see the shift change. During World War I, soldiers were returning home, and the government at that time engaged in concerted efforts and campaigns to ensure that these veterans were employed and instituted a number of acts. The Smith-Hughes Act of 1917 was established and established federal funding for vocational educational programs specifically for veterans with disabilities and created a federal board of vocational education. The Soldiers Rehabilitation Act of 1918 was the first vocational rehabilitation program for veterans. The National Civilian Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1920 extended these programs for individuals who were not veterans, but to adults with disabilities across the community, and also contributed funding to vocational counseling, training, vocational adjustments, and employment services. In 1945, President Harry Truman designated the week of October 7th to October 13th as National Employ the Physically Handicapped Week to encourage individual people with disabilities to employ people with disabilities. And you can see here is a poster from that campaign featuring a man with a split hook hand working on a hydraulic gauge unit. So here we see the shift change, but I want to bring your attention to what the identities we see in this picture in terms of when people with disabilities begin to be perceived as contributors or potential contributors to society. And this is when primarily white men were returning home from war disabled that we begin to see the shift. This perception was not extended to white women, and this perception was not extended to people, women or men of color. Time to reflect. So again, take about a minute or so and think about the content I just shared in terms of how people with disabilities were perceived in the past, in terms of the isolation, in terms of the segregation, and in terms of the government forcing their rights on the bodies of individuals with disabilities, particularly in terms of women with disabilities. So take about 1 minute and reflect on that information. I'll start the timer now. Okay. So as you think about sort of the history, what stands out to me and what I'm hoping really sort of resonates with you, is really how far we've come, right? How far we've come from the way in which we perceive who is worthy of being educated, who is worthy of being treated with humanity, how we perceive difference, and to where we are today. So we've come so far, but I also would like you to think about how much more, how much further we need to go, and how the remnants of some of those biases, some of those assumptions, some of those attitudes show up in how we think about people with disabilities today, right? How do they still show up to some degree in how we think about students with disabilities today? Who belongs in our classrooms? Who belongs in our schools? To what extent do we think about inclusive practices? And some of the ways in which we can sort of trace back some of the biases that we may confront today with some of the historical biases that were at play back in before the 1900s and all the way up to the 1960s. So now we've talked about how people with disabilities were perceived in the 1900s, and we talked about the beginning of that shift of perception, right? And that's coming really in the 1920s, when veterans began to return home from the war as individuals with disabilities. When did it really take hold, though, in terms of the disability rights movement? And what were the major levers? So there were three major levers that really instigated and provided momentum from disability to the disability rights movement. And these levers are advocacy, activism, and legal actions. So the disability rights movement was really propelled into action through advocacy, activism, and legal action. So let's talk a little bit about advocacy. Some of the strongest individuals or groups that really had a powerful impact on the rights of rights of people with disabilities are parents. Were parents of people with disabilities, and parents of children with disabilities continue to be a major force to be reckoned with even today. The parents movement began again in the early 1900s and really continued to present day, was a decisive factor in the disability rights movement. Parents began to organize, starting as late as the 1940s, and began to really recognize the intolerable conditions and stances for individuals with disabilities in society, particularly in community and in educational settings. Parents organized, parents complained, parents took their children to their neighborhood schools and tried to enroll them. And when they were denied, parents then filed lawsuits against states, against institutions, on behalf and in acknowledgement of the civil rights and legal rights of their children. So we can't underestimate the power of parents and the power of parents with disability, of children with disabilities. They are a powerful group today. Many of our parents of children with disabilities are a powerful lever and group today, and there's a history of parents of children with disabilities as being powerful advocates, and really one of the propelling factors in the disability rights movement. The ARC is a national organization of parents and friends of children with intellectual disabilities, which was founded back in 1953 and is today the largest national community-based organization in the United States that advocates for and with individuals with disabilities. So advocacy has a history of having a strong impact and an instrumental lever in the disability rights movement. Activism is the next huge lever in the disability rights movement. So the disability rights movement has its as a blueprint, if you will, used as a blueprint the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And you can follow along, you can see the parallels between how organizers and early organizers of the disability rights movement and how they use strategies and tactics and laws and legislation and court cases that were hard fought and integral to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And in many ways, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s offered models for political action and ideological frameworks for people with disabilities to engage both in group advocacy and activism. So you see here several pictures on the screen illustrating the various ways in which people with disabilities began to advocate for themselves. And I want to really underscore the importance of understanding the power of disabled people engaging in civil disobedience, of disabled people engaging in protest for themselves, so that the hard-fought laws and rights that disabled people benefit from today did not come from the benevolence of non-disabled people, but came through the fighting and activism of individuals with disabilities across disabilities categories, so people with varying types of disabilities, and across racial and socioeconomic communities as well. So you see acts of civil disobedience in these pictures. I want to draw your attention up to the picture on the right corner of the screen. And what you see there is a picture of a civil disobedience act in Denver, where individuals with disabilities in Denver were fighting for the right to use public transportation. And they wanted public buses to include wheelchair ramps, and they wanted to have the right to use the public transportation that their taxes were contributing to, just as non-disabled people have the right and access to public transportation as well. So those individuals that you see laying on the ground are people with disabilities who were wheelchair users laying on the ground in front of a public bus in protest against the inaccessibility of public transportation for people with disabilities. That civil disobedience, those tactics were learned from the kinds of protests and civil disobedience acts that were prominent of the 1950s and went a long way to establishing the disability rights disabled people experience today. Ed Roberts, who's known as really the father of the disability rights movement, starting back in the 1960s. He was a student with polio who enrolled in the University of California, Berkeley. But later, his admission was rejected because he had a disability, and the university stated that they could not accommodate him. They could not enroll him because he had a disability. Ed Roberts sued, as you can imagine, sued the university for admission. He also sued because he could not live in the dorm because the dorm rooms at that time were inaccessible. He fought to get the decision overturned, and in that fight became really the father of what is known today as the independent living movement. The independent living movement stands in opposition of the idea that people with disabilities should be institutionalized, and instead argues that people with disabilities should be fully integrated in all aspects of community and society, and supports the self-determination of people with disabilities. Judy Heumann, known as really the mother of the disability rights movement, also joined Ed Roberts in as being instrumental in founding the independent living movement. But Judy Heumann went on to do a number of things and really have led disability rights for years. And just recently, Judy Heumann passed away. Between April 5th and April 28th in 1977, hundreds of disabled and handicapped activists, the term handicap was used at that time, activists organized and protested to occupy government buildings around the country. This became known as the 504 sit-in. The purpose of the sit-in was to ensure that Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was published into regulations. Many educators know today are very familiar with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and many employers are also aware of Section 504. Section 504 was the most powerful federal protection for disabled people in the country before the passage of the American Disabilities Act in 1990. It was due to this sit-in that lasted over 28 days that forced the American government to sign the 504 regulations and to enforce the regulations and the protection of people with disabilities. This sit-in represented over 100 people with disabilities across the spectrum of the disability community, including a wide variety of disabilities from various racial, socioeconomic backgrounds, as well as age, as well as those individuals without disabilities, disability allies, and children with disabilities. This is one of the most powerful and most successful acts of civil disobedience in our country. This is important information for all of our students to know, including our students with disabilities, to know who Judy Heumann was and to know the impact of the Section 504 sit-ins. Legislation was the next lever for the disability rights movement. And I'm just going to talk through some of the major laws that really contribute to the rights that we experience and benefit from today in terms of access and inclusion of people with disabilities and the shift and perception of the people with disabilities in our society. The first is the 1935 Social Security Act, which provided funding support for disabled people, which helped to lift millions of people with disabilities out of poverty. 1963, and this is I'm going to say a term that we don't say today, but it was a part of that particular time, a term that was used, and this is the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act. This act provided funding and support for creating accessible and resource centers for individuals with intellectual disabilities. The 1904 Civil Rights Act contributed to not only expanding the rights to people on the basis of race, sex, national origin, and religion, but also was considered one of the cornerstones in the advancement of people with the rights for people with disabilities. The 1965 Voting Act prohibited the exclusion and denial of any people to vote, including people with disabilities. And the 1965 Elementary Secondary Education Act extended civil rights protection for students living in under-resourced communities and also ensuring that students with disabilities have access to public education resources. The 1965 Higher Education Act also extended protections to people with disabilities in higher education in colleges and universities. The Architectural Barrier Act ensured that buildings created after 1965 needed to be accessible for people with disabilities. The 1973 Rehabilitation Act is an act I just talked about, and extended rights broadly and really prohibited the discrimination of individuals based on their disability, whether we're talking about access to physical buildings or access to resources and job opportunities. The 1964 ugly laws, the 1964, that year was the year that the last, what was considered ugly law was repealed from state laws. The ugly laws were a set of laws that various different states enacted that really basically stated that anyone who didn't look desirable could be arrested and removed from the community, removed from street, taken into jail because they were quote unquote undesirable, and that was applied disproportionately to people with disabilities. And then of course, Public Law 94-142, otherwise known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is the precursor of what we know today as IDEA. And this law required that students with disabilities receive free and appropriate public education. The last lever, when we think about what were those critical levers that ushered us into the disability rights era and beyond, is legal action. So we talked about advocacy, we talked about activism, we talked about legislation, and now we're going to talk about legal action. So what were different court cases that really brought about change? So the following are the various really critically important legal actions. The first one is the Brown versus Board. And what was pivotal about the Brown versus Board of Education Act is that, or case, is that although it focused on integration, racial integration, what it did is that it reversed the separate but equal doctrine that was enacted since the Plessy decision. And what it said is that separate is not equal. And disability rights activists then used that pronouncement that separate was indeed not equal, separate cannot be equal, to fight for the integration and inclusion of people with students with disabilities, particularly in our educational settings. I'm going to pause right there because my notes for these legal actions did not print out, so I don't have my notes in front of me. So I might have to get back to you on some of these legislation, legal actions, but I will talk through what I can from my memory. I'm going to jump to Judy Heumann when she sued the New York City Board of Education in 1970. So Judy Heumann, and we talked about Judy Heumann before as being the mother really of the disability rights movement. She became one of the first teachers in New York City with a disability. And she was employed by the New York City School District, and then she was let go because of being a wheelchair user, and the district refused to make the appropriate accommodations for her to enable her to teach and to work. And so Judy Heumann sued the Board of Education for discrimination, and as such, there were accommodations that were then provided so that she can do her job. The Pennsylvania Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Children, again, that term that we don't use today, but was part of the vernacular at that time, versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, was another one of those advocacy group of parents of children with disabilities, and they fought the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for the right for their children to receive a public education, to be taught in their public neighborhood schools, in the school district, and to receive the appropriate educational accommodations necessary. Mills versus Board of Education District of Columbia, a very similar fight. Parents of children with disabilities fought their public education, their Board of Education for the right of their children to be educated in public education settings. And what these two court cases did was that really provided the structure for what, again, we know today as IDEA, and put in place a number of rulings. One, that students with disabilities deserve and have the right to what is called FAPE, and that is free and appropriate public education. And so the public school districts have to put in place and provide educational experiences that's free, that's appropriate for their child, as a result or as a part of their receiving public education. The appropriate part comes through what we call now IEPs, or individual education plans. And through those plans, what is described is what then is appropriate education for that particular child with a child with disability. That came out of the Park decision. The Mills decision was really critical in that, as a result of the Mills decision, a lot of the due process laws that we work under today for students with disabilities comes out of the Mills decision. So the right of parents to be informed consent, a right to have due process, really stem from those legal actions. And then Olmstead versus the EW 1999 took the accessibility of young people being able to experience appropriate education to the secondary setting. So what's next, right? When we talk about disabilities, we talk about disability rights, we've come a long way from being excluded, from being in isolation, from being institutionalized, to where we are today, where we have our children who have disabilities learning alongside and integrated with our non-disabled students in our public educational settings and classrooms, where we have people with disabilities as full participants, integrated in our community, able to benefit public transportation, able to have access to public buildings, able to have the right and the accessibility to vote, to employment, that prohibits discrimination based on disability. And these are the rights, the hard fought rights that people with disabilities benefit from today. But we want to ask the question, do people with disabilities fully benefit, right? Is there full justice? Do we still have instances of discrimination against people with disabilities because of lack of access, because of lack of accommodations? And the answer to that question is yes. So while we've come a long way, we have not arrived at a place in our society where people with disabilities are truly integrated in all aspects of our society. So when we come together again, we're going to talk about what does it mean to move from fighting for rights to fighting towards justice. I want to thank you all today for engaging with me on this content. I apologize for my note around the legal court actions did not print out, so I apologize for that, but I will make those legal actions available so that you can have them as a reference, and I'll send them to the team so they can post those legal actions and what they really resulted in. But again, thank you for listening to this dialogue. Again, it's something that's very passionate, and it's very personal to me. And I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to speaking with you all again in May.
Well, thank you, Dr. Skelton, for sharing your knowledge with us throughout this series, or at least the beginning to start this series. Your work is important to Michigan's educators and leaders as we work to teach comprehensive history within our classrooms. We sincerely appreciate you starting the series out, and creating this and helping us in this important effort by the department and the work that we're doing. So thank you so much. Thank you, Teaching Comprehensive History team, for your work. We appreciate all that you're doing, including those that are working here that many of you are seeing, Candace as well. So thank you, Candace. Dr. Rice reminds us that as members of a diverse state, nation, and world, school staff and students need to know our rich, complex history. These powerful webinars, along with the provided resources, encourage Michigan educators and school leaders to deepen their knowledge so they may share with their students. Share with their students. As searing as some of our history is, we have a responsibility to teach it all. The next webinar to this two-part series, titled Disability Rights Movement, continues on May 3rd from 4 to 5 p.m. Please note that each webinar will present new content. We encourage educators to visit the Teaching Comprehensive History website and register for each date to participate in future webinars as linked in the chat box. We invite you to register again for these events. Thank you all for joining us today and the work that you do for Michigan students. Please make sure to complete the survey for this event that will be emailed to you when today's webinar is closed. Again, thanks for attending. Have a great rest of your day.